Historicism is a theory of prophecy which turns days into years on principle. I don't think that's right. Days are days in prophecy, not years. So once you turn, for example, 1290 days, which you find there in Daniel 12, if you say, well, that really means 1290 years, it would mean that you could predict the second coming 1290 years before it happened. I think that's just wrong. So better start then with the 70 weeks in the Daniel prophecy. And those weeks are not literally weeks, they're sevens, units of seven. So there's no day-year theory built into that phrase. There are 77s, shavuim. Shavua is a unit of seven. It has to be years in this case to make any sense. So 77s, 490 years, have been mapped out in God's plan, first to the first coming of Jesus, and that happened, and then that final week from all the evidence from Revelation, where half of that final period of seven, in other words, 3.5 years, shows up again in the book of Revelation. That's interesting. So that last half of the 70th period of seven is the Great Tribulation just before the second coming. That's all outlined in Matthew 24, where Jesus looked at the buildings in front of him. He didn't know whether those buildings would in fact be the ones that ushered in the second coming or the destruction of them. He didn't know that. He didn't know that. How could he possibly know? As it turns out, AD 70 was not the abomination of desolation spoken of by Jesus, because we know from Matthew 24 that the abomination of desolation, the horrifying, awful thing standing in the temple, as Paul said, will be followed immediately by the second coming. So if you want a really key verse in all of this discussion, you take Matthew 24, which says, immediately after the great tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and then they will see the Son of Man coming in splendid glory. The immediately after, this is the phrase that's given everybody a lot of trouble. No need for that. Jesus meant exactly what he said. Immediately after that tribulation, which had been predicted in Daniel 12, key verse, Daniel speaks about a time of trouble unparalleled. And Jesus knew about that. Daniel 12:1 is a key verse. And Jesus said there in 29 of Matthew 24, immediately. You don't have don't need a mathematician or some expert linguist to tell you what that means. Immediately after the great tribulation of those days, there'll be heavenly signs, catastrophic celestial signs, and then they will see the Son of Man, that's Jesus, coming in power and glory. That's rather easy. So you have final 70th period of seven, final 70th week, just prior to the second coming. And that will last then for 3.5 years, half of that final period of seven. So we believe there will be a pseudo peace made between an antichrist figure for a period of 7 years, that final years. And right in the middle of that final 7 years, all hell will break loose, so to speak. Evil person who's involved in setting up the abomination of desolation will turn nasty and will turn on Israel. Then there'll be a time of great tribulation. And immediately after that, Jesus will come back. That's futurism. And by describing that, I think I've really done away with historicism, which turns all of those 1,260 days into 1,260 years. That is very problematic. You'd be able to predict the second coming 1,260 years before it happened. I don't think you want to try that. So that's futurism of the classical type. Early church fathers believe what I just said, largely, and I think Jesus did. Big subject, but start with Matthew 24 and never forget immediately after the tribulation of those days. That's a key verse. It's true that the Roman Catholic Jesuits reintroduced the scheme that I've just described, classical futurism. Well, I think they did actually return to something much more biblical, but that wasn't an error. So what I just gave you then is a futurist scheme with the 70th heptad, period of seven, the final of the 490 years, the final 7 years will be very, very important. There'll be a temple built in Israel, we believe, and a false Messiah will set himself up there as the abomination of desolation, standing where he ought not to. If you want a key verse for your notes, Mark 13:14 says The abomination of desolation is a person. How do I know that? Because the Greek verb there agrees with a person. It says, when you see in Mark 13:14, when you see the abomination, the awful horror, standing where he, that's a he there, not an it, standing where he ought not to, in the temple, then if you happen to be in Israel, you better get out of there quickly. You better flee. What you do in Georgia, I don't know. We'd have to wait and see. But that's the futurist scheme. And yes, the Jesuits got on some of that way back. I think they got it right on that point. Check out the early church fathers, and you'll see that that's the scheme. It's very, very ancient in the church.